Hi everyone, hope you had a restful half term and managed to take a bit of a break from studying. We're going to start this half term firstly by recapping some of the stuff we did before half term and then moving on to add to that knowledge. So before you complete this PowerPoint, please can you go over to show my homework where I've set a very short 7-question quiz recapping what we did the week before half term. You need that knowledge for the final task on this PowerPoint, so please make sure you do it before doing this PowerPoint. So this PowerPoint is about childhood. So we're looking at how childhood has changed over time. So before half term, you were looking at how the family generally has changed. So has it become smaller, larger? Whereas now we're looking specifically at children within the family. We're going to be looking at the idea that childhood is a social construction, and we're going to be thinking about whether childhood has improved over time or not. So what was childhood like in pre-industrial society? Have a little think. What do you think life was like for a child? Do you think it was good? If you think about what Parsons said, he said that we lived in big extended families. Would children have had a positive role in that family, or do you think it would have been quite difficult for them? They'd have had lots of adult work to do to try and keep the household running. A sociologist called Ariès, who we're going to be looking at now, said that children were seen as an economic asset, so something that brings money in rather than a symbol of people's love for each other. Generally, in modern society, we see a child as being very special. We see it as something to celebrate. And it is an expression of a couple's love for each other usually. And so we can see perhaps from Ariès' perspective how that has changed. So if you could please have a look at this video that gives you a little bit more in detailed information about what Philippe Ariès argues. Just to summarise, he essentially is saying that childhood is a modern social construct. So what this means is childhood as we know it today did not exist before industrialization. It's a new thing, the way we treat children today. Children were not special back then. They were just seen as a way to make money, to get jobs done. Whereas now we see childhood as a very special time in a person's life, and it's a time where they grow, they play, they learn who they are. This might have been because in pre-industrial society, there was a very high infant mortality rate. So what this means is babies were more likely to die than they are today before they turned 2. So parents kind of had lots of children, and they didn't really invest emotionally in any of these children because there was this, high chance that they could die. So they didn't really invest emotionally because they might pass away, and also because they were just a way to make money. Ariès says that in pre-industrial times, children were seen as little adults. So they weren't really seen as children. They were seen as miniature adults who took part in the same work as adults from age 5 or 6. So at a very young age, children had adult responsibilities. So children typically worked alongside their families, and this might have been perhaps doing farm work, agricultural work, or it might have been in the household, running the household, making sure it's clean, doing cooking, etc. Remember, they didn't have all the mod cons that we have today, so it was a bigger job. Or they left home to become servants in other people's, rich people's houses, or they would become apprentices for craftsmen, and they would learn a trade. So the way Ariès actually found all this out was partly through paintings as a way to study childhood. And obviously paintings are a bit of an odd way to do research. And we can say that it doesn't really give us data that's high in validity. And that's because obviously the artist is painting not for historic record necessarily to tell us the truth, but to paint something that whoever is paying them wants to see. So if I'm paying somebody to do me a picture, I'm basically going to tell them what I want them to paint, right? So it might not be an accurate picture of what life was really like for children back then. So maybe Ariès' work is flawed, But generally, we can say, some of his ideas are really supported by other documents and other studies. So we can say with quite a certain degree of confidence that RES is probably correct, that children were seen as little adults and that parents didn't invest emotionally in their children like we do today. So, children and industrialization. So, these attitudes about children continued when industrialization happened. So, remember, industrialization is when there was rapid social and economic change in the UK. All these factories suddenly emerged in the towns and cities, and children were expected to work in these factories, to work in mines, to work in mills from a very young age. So, we've got pictures there of children working in poor conditions. The top lot of children, maybe they were working in a factory, but they might have also been doing things like chimney sweeping, working in a mine. They look quite dirty. So perhaps, they were doing quite dangerous work. Working in a factory was quite dangerous because children were used to kind of crawl between the machines. Often children died because they would become trapped, or they would lose arms and legs because the machine would start to work and it would crush them. So, children were used in these really terrible conditions when industrialization started. However, RES also says that middle class attitudes began to change during this time. And that's because during industrialization, babies started to survive. So infant mortality rates began to fall. It was less likely that your child would die at a young age. And obviously, it was the middle class children that were surviving the most because the middle class parents had better access to nutrition, so good food and medical care. So middle class children were more likely to survive. And so the middle class parents, their attitude began to change towards children, and they began to see children as a part of, or as a symbol of their love, rather than a way to make money. By the mid-19th century, children were excluded from factories because of the concerns over their safety. So you can see how adults started to see children as special and didn't want them to be harmed. So has the position of children really improved? Obviously, we saw that they were excluded from work, and that was really the start of seeing children in a different way. So on the left-hand side, I've got some pictures that suggest that the position of children has improved. So the first picture is to represent the idea that children are an expression of parental love, and parents are having less children than in the past because they kind of want to make sure that they do everything they can for perhaps 1, 2, 3 children rather than 8, 9, 10 children. They feel like they can invest more of their time and money into fewer children to give them a better life. We can also see the position of children has improved through the amount of money that is being spent on children. So that's why I've got a picture of that baby in a money bag. The amount of money spent on children each year is increasing. And this is obviously because parents are wanting to, give the best opportunities in life for their children. And then the last one there is children's rights. So there never used to be children's rights. There wasn't really a special branch of children's rights at all until the modern times. So now obviously children have rights to not work. They have a right to education. If you think about medicine as well, there never used to be children's hospitals or children's wards. That wasn't a thing. Whereas now we have pediatric medicine. We have specialists who can actually take care of children and specialize in children's needs. So we can see that we're seeing children as something that's more precious than before. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, I've got pictures that show that the position of children has not improved. If you think about video games and television programs, they've got ratings on them, but largely either children find ways of getting around these, or parents are not really concerned with sticking to the ratings given on films and video games, and children often have access to things that are perhaps too old for them. Secondly, we can say that the increase in exams and pressure from school has increased significantly. Your generation is probably one of the most examined generations ever, and there's lots of pressure to perform in exams. And lastly, we can say that childhood obesity is now an epidemic. it never used to be, whereas now children are eating more unhealthily than ever before, having a higher intake of sugar and fat, and that's obviously having health impacts on children. And so really their position hasn't improved. Actually, it's probably a bad thing that this is happening to them, and can have long-term impacts on their health and their success in life. So Sue Palmer actually talks about childhood in modern society, and she says that childhood is actually toxic. So if you look at these headlines from various newspapers, you can see how other experts have kind of echoed what Sue Palmer has said, how, modern society isn't good for children. So the first one there about guidelines on how much screen time children are exposed to, how our culture perhaps is toxic for children, having to constantly entertain children through laptops and iPads and social media. So Sue Palmer actually lists ways in which she believes childhood has become toxic. So firstly, she says there's been a decline of outdoor play, and obviously this is toxic for children because there's that link to increasing obesity. 2, the commercialization of childhood. So commercialization is about, advertisers exploiting children. When it comes to Christmas time, there are hundreds of adverts about toys, and they are played at times when they know children will be watching television. They are targeting children because they know that they'll be watching. So childhood has become more about what you have and don't have, and what your parents can buy you than anything else, according to Sue Palmer. The decline of listening, language, and communication skills. So these skills have been, taken away from children, or children have been de-skilled in these areas because of shortened attention spans. And she attributes this largely to things like technology. When you're texting, you're not actually using sufficient communication skills. Listening and language skills are not developed through technology as much. Screen saturation reduces face-to-face interaction. So screen saturation, again, is all about how much time you're spending on laptops, TV, phones, and that reduces face-to-face interaction with real human beings, and she sees that as a negative thing. And lastly, tests, targets, and education. This increases anxiety among children. We know that mental health amongst children has declined in recent years, and there is more of a focus on helping children to deal with negative mental health. And she thinks that this is largely down to education and how we're putting too much pressure on children. So you might agree with some of these, you might disagree with others. You might think she maybe is over-exaggerating, or you might think that actually she's spot on. So think about, there's a challenge there. Was life really better for children in the past? So this kind of makes it seem like life is terrible for children now. But if you think about in the past, surely this is better than being shoved in a factory where you might die, or not having enough to eat, or not being cared for, not being given any rights, etc. So think about, yes, Sue Palmer might be right, but is she exaggerating too much? Is it really as terrible as she makes out? So if you could please just fill in the blanks here. So pause the video, fill in those, and then obviously I'll mark it when you send it to me. So this is a 12-mark question that you could get in the exam. So to what extent do sociologists agree that significant changes to the family have occurred in the UK? Now, to answer this question, we have to use the work we did before half term and today's lesson. So that's why I asked you to do that recap quiz on Show My Homework before you did this PowerPoint, because it involves some of that information. So I'm just going to run through what sort of things you could say, and then I've got some sentence starters for you to help you answer this question. So firstly, we can say that there have been significant changes to the family in the UK. Family types are way more diverse than they ever were before. So if you think about family types now, we've got lone parent families, extended families, single parent families, gay families. This is different to the past where perhaps the nuclear family or the extended family were the dominant family type. Now we've got a larger array of families. And secondly, we can say family life is very different for children specifically because the role of children has dramatically changed over time. They are no longer workers and the family is more child-centred. On the other hand, you can say the changes are not that significant and perhaps they've been over-exaggerated by some sociologists. So firstly, you can say family diversity is over-exaggerated. People live in a nuclear family at some point in their lives. Yes, there are loads of different family types now, but actually most people aspire to live in a nuclear family, or they will end up in a nuclear family at some point. They might not start off in a nuclear family, but they might end up in one. So really, we can say the nuclear family is still probably the main family type, and that hasn't really changed. And secondly, life for children has not really changed. In the past, there were lots of risks for children, as we mentioned before, in factories, the fact that they didn't have as many rights, they didn't have specialist medicine, etc. And today there are also many risks. So things like obesity, video games, education, putting pressure on them. So really, we could say that there hasn't really been much of a change for children. There was risk for children in the past and there's risk for children now. All that's changed is the type of risks that they experience. So here are the sentence starters to help you answer this question. I've put some clues there for you. So NF, what type of family might that be? In the second paragraph, I've put L, so that's the start of a name of a sociologist. So if you can't remember the sociologists looked at before, so Parsons, Laslett and Anderson, I've put the information here again on the next slide for you, but also it was in the quiz and it was in the PowerPoint before half term. So if you could have a go at answering this 12-mark question and send it to your teacher by Friday, that would be great. If you get stuck or you find this 12-marker too difficult, please email me and I will help you. I'll steer you in the right direction. That's all for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.